The shuttle screamed through the atmosphere of Kethra Prime like a wounded bird falling from the sky, and Commander Elena Vasquez fought the controls with everything she had left in her tired arms. The pirates had come out of nowhere, 3 ships appearing from behind the gas giant's largest moon. And they had torn her diplomatic vessel apart. In less than 2 minutes now she was falling, burning, dying maybe. And all she could do was try to aim for something that looked like flat ground. The impact threw her forward against her harness so hard that she tasted blood. And then everything went dark and silent for a while when Elena opened her eyes again. The first thing she noticed was the purple sky above her. And the second thing she noticed was the pain that seemed to fill every part of her body from head to toe. She crawled out of the wreckage slowly, checking herself for broken bones as she moved, and found that she was somehow still in one piece, despite everything that had happened. The desert stretched out around her in every direction, a wasteland of red sand and strange crystalline formations that caught the light of the twin suns and scattered it into rainbow patterns across the ground. Her emergency beacon was destroyed, crushed in the crash, and her communication equipment was nothing but sparking wires and melted plastic. Now Elena stood up slowly and looked around, trying to remember what she knew about this planet from her briefing files. Kethra Prime was the homeworld of the Volcari, an insectoid species that had been part of the Galactic Concordat for over 2,000 years. And they were known for viewing humans as primitive creatures barely worth acknowledging. She had been on her way to a minor trade negotiation. Nothing important, really. And now she was stranded in what looked like the most hostile environment she had ever seen. The heat was incredible, pressing down on her like a physical weight, and she knew she had maybe 2 days of water in her survival kit if she was. Careful, Elena picked a direction and started walking, because staying with the wreckage would only mean dying slower instead of faster. She had been walking for perhaps 3 hours when she heard the sound, a weak clicking noise that rose and fell in a pattern that almost sounded like speech. Elena followed the sound around a large crystal formation and stopped dead in her tracks at what she found there. An overturned transport vehicle lay on its side, and beneath it, trapped under a pile of crystalline debris, was a Valkyrie, but not just any Valkyrie. Elena realized as she got closer and saw the elaborate patterns on the creature's carapace and the golden bands around her upper arms. This was someone important, someone royal maybe, and she was clearly dying. The young Valkyrie female was barely conscious, her forearms twitching weakly as she tried to free herself from the debris that pinned her down, and the bioluminescent markings that covered her body flickered like a candle about to go out. Elena knelt down beside her, and the Valkyrie's compound eyes focused on her with obvious fear and confusion. Here was a human, one of those primitive creatures, kneeling in the sacred bleeding wastes where no offworlder was ever permitted to walk. Elena did not speak. Valkyrie and the young female clearly did not speak human standard, but some things needed no translation at all. Elena pointed at the debris, then at herself, then made a lifting motion with her hands. The Valkyrie stared at her for a long moment, and then slowly, painfully, she nodded. Elena worked for hours under the burning suns, using pieces of hull plating from her crashed shuttle as levers to move the crystalline rocks. One by one, her hands bled from the sharp edges, leaving red stains on everything she touched. But she did not stop. The Valkyrie watched her work with those strange compound eyes, and Elena could not read the expression there, but she thought maybe it was something like wonder when the last piece of debris was finally moved. Elena carefully examined the young female's injuries and found that her carapace was cracked in several places, and one of her legs was bent at a terrible angle. Elena had no medical training for Valkyrie physiology, no idea what might help or what might make things worse. But she knew that staying here meant death for both of them. She used strips of emergency blanket to bind the worst of the cracks, working gently while the Valkyrie made soft clicking sounds that might have been pain or might have been gratitude. Then Elena looked toward the horizon. where she could see a faint shimmer that might be heat distortion or might be distant buildings. And she made her decision she could not carry the Valkyrie, who was larger and heavier than her. But she could support her weight and help her walk. Elena gestured toward the shimmer on the horizon, and the Valkyrie understood, reaching out with two of her arms to grip Elena's shoulders while Elena wrapped an arm around her thorax. They began to walk together, slowly and painfully, across the red sand under the purple sky. The first day was bad, and the first night was worse, with temperatures dropping so low that Elena had to press herself against the Valkyrie's body just to keep from freezing. But they kept moving whenever they could, resting only when they absolutely had to, and Elena shared her water with the young female, even though it meant she would run out sooner on the second day. Elena's vision began to blur from dehydration and radiation exposure, and her skin had turned an angry red that hurt with every movement. Her emergency beacon back at the shuttle might be destroyed, but her personal locator was still working, sending out a weak signal that her people might eventually detect. She could have activated it at any time, could have stayed where she was and waited for rescue, could have left the alien to her fate. But every time she looked at the young Valkyrie leaning against her, every time she felt the desperate grip on her shoulders, Elena kept walking instead. 46 hours after the crash, they finally reached the edge of a Valkyrie settlement, and Elena collapsed to her knees as workers came running toward them. With clicks and whistles of alarm, the last thing she saw before unconsciousness took her was the young female being lifted gently by her own people, those compound eyes still fixed on Elena's face with an expression that no human had ever seen from a Valkyrie before. It looked almost like love. Princess Ithrani awakened in the medical alcove of her mother's hive with the taste of healing salves on her mandibles and the memory of a nightmare that turned out to be real. She remembered the crash, the transport vehicle rolling across the crystal fields after the steering mechanism failed. And she remembered the terror of being trapped beneath the debris while her bodyguards lay dead around her. But most of all, she remembered the medical attendants told her everything when she demanded answers. And what they told her made no sense at all. The human female had carried her across the bleeding wastes for almost 2 full days, sharing water and food, binding her wounds with strange soft materials, pressing warmth into her body during the frozen nights. The human had done all of this despite being injured herself, despite having a working locator beacon that could have summoned her own rescue at any time, despite having no reason whatsoever to help a Valkyrie princess. And now that same human lay in a nearby alcove, unconscious and barely alive, her soft pink skin burned and blistered from radiation, her body depleted from dehydration and exhaustion. Ithranen rose from her bed, despite the protests of her attendants, and made her way to where the human lay. She stood there for a long time, looking down at this strange small creature who had saved her life. And she felt something stirring in her chest that she had no name for in Valkyrie culture. There was a concept called the Kethful, the soul dead, and it was the most sacred and terrible bond that could exist between two beings. When someone saved your life at risk of their own, when they gave of themselves without asking anything in return, the Kethful was formed, and it bound the souls of both parties across lifetimes and beyond death itself. Thrani had learned about the Kethful in her education, had read ancient texts describing the bond, but she had never expected to experience it herself, and she had certainly never expected to experience it with a human, a species her people considered barely more intelligent than clever animals. The human slept for 3 days before finally opening her eyes, and Ithrani was there when she did. Sitting beside the bed with a translator device she had demanded from the communication archives, the human looked at her with those strange round eyes, 2 instead of many, and she smiled with her soft fleshy mouth. Ithrani activated the translator and spoke the words she had been rehearsing for days. "You saved me," she said. A clicking speech transformed into human sounds by the device. You risked your life for mine and you asked for nothing. And now I owe you a debt that cannot be repaid in 1,000 lifetimes. The human looked confused for a moment, tilting her head in a gesture that Ithraney found oddly endearing. I do not understand, the human said through the translator. You were hurt and you were scared, and I was there. So what else was I supposed to do? Ithraney stared at her, unable to process what she was hearing in Velkari society. Nothing was given without expectation. No favor was offered without calculation. And the strong survived by exploiting the weak at every opportunity. The idea that someone would risk their life for a stranger, especially a stranger from a species they had no connection to, simply because it was the right thing to do, was so foreign to Ithraney that she could barely comprehend it. You could have called your own people, Ithraney said slowly. You could have left me there and saved yourself, and no one would have blamed you. The human shrugged. A gesture Ithraney learned later was a sign of casual dismissal. I could not just leave you, the human said simply. That is not who I am. Over the following weeks, as diplomatic channels worked frantically to arrange the human's return to her people, Ithraney found herself unable to stay away from Elena. She learned the human's name, learned to say it with her mandibles in a way that sounded almost correct. And she spent every moment she could in Elena's company. She watched Elena interact with the workers of the settlement, saw her offer to help with tasks she could barely perform, saw her share her strange human food with anyone who expressed curiosity. She watched Elena attempt to learn Velkari gestures of greeting and respect, her human body completely unsuited to the movements, but her efforts so genuine and earnest that even the most xenophobic elders found themselves charmed. She watched Elena sit with a dying elder in the final days of his life, holding his clawed hand and humming soft human songs, even though they could not understand each other's words. And slowly, day by day, Ithraney began to understand something that shook the foundations of everything she had ever been taught. Humans were not primitive, not lesser, not unworthy of consideration. They were simply different. And in some ways, in the ways that mattered most, they were better than her own people had ever been. Elena treated everyone with the same respect and kindness, from the highest-ranking officials to the lowest-maintenance workers. And she expected nothing in return except perhaps friendship. This was so alien to Ithraney's experience that it might as well have come from another universe entirely. On the day before Elena was scheduled to leave, Ithraney came to her with a small device in her hands. This is a private communication beacon, she said through the translator. It is keyed to my personal frequency, and if you ever need me for anything at all, you only have to activate it and I will answer. Elena took the device and looked at it, then looked at Ithraney with those warm round eyes. Thank you, she said, but you do not owe me anything. You know that, right? Ithraney felt her bioluminescent markings pulse with emotion. That is exactly why I owe you everything, she replied. Elena left the next morning, boarding the human diplomatic shuttle that had finally been cleared to enter Velkari space. Ithraney stood at the edge of the landing field and watched until the ship was nothing but a speck in the purple sky. And she felt something inside her that was very much like grief, but the beacon remained active. And that night, when Ithraney activated it on impulse, just to see if it worked, Elena answered immediately. I was hoping you would call, the human said, her voice warm even through the static of distance. They talked for hours that first night, about nothing and everything, about their different worlds and different lives. And when they finally said goodbye, Ithraney knew that something fundamental had changed in her. She had made a friend, a real friend, for the first time in her life, and that friend was human. A year passed, and then another, and the private communication beacon remained the most important object in Elena Vasquez's possession. She had been promoted twice since her return from Kethra Prime. her survival, and the unusual diplomatic connection she had made with the Valkyrie princess, earning her recognition among the human fleet, command, but the promotions and the medals and the respect of her peers meant nothing compared to those late-night conversations with Ithranithi talked almost every day, sharing stories about their lives and their worlds. And Elena had learned more about Valkyrie culture from those conversations than any human diplomat had ever known. She learned that Ithrani was the third daughter of Queen Cathara, which made her relatively unimportant in the line of succession, but also meant she was expected to serve as a political tool, a bargaining chip to be married off to whatever noble house offered the best alliance. She learned that Ithrani hated the political games of the Hive, the constant scheming and betrayal, the way everyone used everyone else without any genuine connection. She learned that Ithrani had never had a real friend before Elena, that her sisters saw her as competition and her mother saw her as an asset, and that the concept of unconditional caring was completely foreign to Valkyrie society. And Elena shared her own stories in return, telling Ithrani about her childhood on a colony world, about her parents who had loved her even when she made mistakes, about the human concepts of friendship and loyalty and love that seemed to fascinate the princess endlessly. Somewhere along the way, Elena realized that Ithrani had become the most important person in her life, and she suspected the feeling was mutual. Then one night the beacon activated with an emergency signal, and Elena's world came crashing down. Ithrani's voice was fragmented and desperate, broken up by interference, but the terror in it was unmistakable. "Elena, please, you have to help me," Ithrani said, her translator struggling to keep up with her panicked clicking. "The consort is dead, and my sisters are dead, and they are saying I did it, and I'm going to die. Elena, please. I did not do this. I swear I did not do this." The connection cut out before Elena could respond, and no matter how many times she tried to re-establish it, there was only silence. Elena spent 3 hours trying to get information through official channels, but the Valkyrie had locked down all communication with human space, and no one knew what was happening inside the Hive. She went to her commanding officer and requested emergency leave, and when he denied it, she went to his commanding officer and requested again. When that was denied too, Elena made a decision that would end her career and possibly her life. She stole a fast scout ship from the military dock, disabled its tracking beacon, and set a course for Kethra Prime at maximum speed. The journey took 4 days, and during those 4 days, Elena had plenty of time to think about what she was doing. She was violating at least 17 interstellar treaties by entering Valkyrie space without authorization, and the penalty for that was death in most jurisdictions. She was abandoning her post during peacetime, which was a court-martial offense at minimum. She was throwing away everything she had worked for, her career and her reputation and her future, for a chance to save someone who the Valkyrie considered nothing more than a criminal. But every time Elena thought about turning back, she remembered Ithrani's voice on that last transmission, the fear and the desperation and the absolute faith that Elena would come. No one else in the galaxy would help the princess. Elena knew that for certain Ithrani had no true allies in the Hive, no friends who would risk anything for her sake, no family members who cared whether she lived or died. She had only Elena, and Elena would not let her down. The scout ship was intercepted by Valkyrie patrol vessels within minutes of crossing into their space, and Elena was taken into custody without resistance. She did not fight, and she did not try to run, because running would not help Ithrani. Instead, she demanded, in the broken Valkyrie she had been practicing for months, to be brought before the High Court to invoke the old laws. The guards who held her stared at each other in confusion, because no offworlder had ever invoked the old laws, and many Valkyrie considered the ancient traditions to be nothing more than historical curiosities. But the laws were clear. And a formal invocation could not be ignored. Elena was brought to the Hall of Mandibles, the most sacred chamber in the entire hive, where Queen Kethara herself sat upon the throne of chitin, surrounded by her advisors and nobles. HFY was there too. Elena saw with relief, alive but bound in crystalline restraints, her bioluminescent markings dim with despair. Their eyes met across the vast hall, and Elena saw hope flicker back to life in her friend's compound gaze. Elena walked forward until she stood before the throne. Ignoring the guards who surrounded her and the nobles who clicked and whistled their outrage at her presence, she took a deep breath and spoke the words she had memorized during her journey, the formal phrases that HFY had taught her so many months ago, without either of them knowing how important they would become. "I invoke the right of championship under the old laws," Elena said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I stand for Princess HFY of the Third Clutch, and I demand the trial of Venom to prove her innocence." The court erupted into chaos, 1,000 voices clicking and screaming their disbelief and anger. Queen Kethara raised one clawed hand and silence fell instantly. "You are human," the queen said, her voice cold and ancient. "You have no standing here, no right to invoke laws that were written before your species learned to walk upright." Elena stood her ground and met the queen's compound eyes without flinching. "The old laws make no distinction of species," she replied. "They speak only of the bond between champion and accused, and that bond exists between your daughter and me." The queen stared at her for a long moment, and then her mandibles clicked in what might have been dark amusement. "Very well, human," she said. "If you wish to die for my daughter, the law permits it, and the trial of Venom shall begin at dawn." Elena bowed, a human gesture that somehow seemed appropriate. And when she straightened, she looked at HFY one more time. The princess was weeping. Elena realized, her compound eyes producing tears in a way Elena had never seen before. But beneath the fear and the grief, there was something else in HFY's expression. There was pride, and there was love, and there was absolute faith in the impossible human who had walked into the heart of an empire just to save her. The trial of Venom was designed to break the strongest Valkyrie warriors, and Elena Vasquez was not even close to being the strongest human. She had spent the night in a small cell beneath the arena, unable to sleep, going over everything HFY had ever told her about the trial in their long late-night conversations. 5 rounds, 5 different challenges, each designed to test a different aspect of the accused's worthiness. Survival meant innocence, death meant guilt, and no one had ever survived all 5 rounds who's not Valkyrie-born and bred. Elena had no illusions about her chances, but she also had no intention of dying. The morning came too quickly and not quickly enough, and Elena was brought to the arena floor while thousands of Valkyrie watched from the crystalline stands above. HFY was there in a cage at the edge of the arena, forced to watch her champion fight and probably die. And Elena made sure to look at her before the trial began. "I am going to win," Elena said in Valkyrie, loud enough for her friend to hear. HFY's markings pulsed with desperate hope. The first round was called the Test of Endurance, and it involved standing in a chamber while venom sacs released their contents into the air. Around her Valkyrie had natural resistance to most toxins, their carapaces protecting them from absorption. But humans had no such protection. Elena felt the venom burning in her lungs and on her skin within seconds, and every instinct she had screamed at her to run. Instead, she thought about HFY, thought about the way the princess laughed at Elena's terrible jokes, thought about those long conversations that had become the center of her universe. She stayed in the chamber for the full required time, and when she stumbled out, she was coughing blood and her vision was blurred. But she was alive, and the crowd had fallen silent with shock. The second round was the test of strength, and Elena was given a weapon and told to fight a Valkyrie blade dancer. Blade dancer was faster than her, stronger than her, better armed and better armored. And absolutely certain that this soft pink creature would fall within moments, Elena used that arrogance against him, feinting weakness and letting him grow confident. And then she struck at the joints between his carapace plates where, if Rainey had once told her the nerve clusters lay exposed, the blade dancer fell. Not dead but disabled, and Elena stood over him breathing hard while the crowd roared their disbelief. The third round was the test of mind. A complex puzzle that had to be solved while pain sticks were applied to the contestants. Body Elena screamed and cried and begged for mercy. But her hands never stopped working, and she completed the puzzle with tears streaming down her face. 3 rounds survived. And no one in living memory had seen a non-Valkyrie survive even one. The 4th round was called the Test of Will. And it was the cruelest of all. Elena was shown images of her home, her family, everything she had left behind. And she was offered a choice. She could walk away right now, leave Kethra Prime with her life, and only Eth Rainey would suffer the consequences. All she had to do was say the words, and she would be free. Elena looked at the projection of her mother's face, the woman who had raised her to be kind and brave and true, and she knew exactly what her mother would want her to do. No, Elena said, her voice hoarse but steady. I will not abandon my friend. The crowd was completely silent now, and even Queen Kethara had leaned forward on her throne, her ancient eyes fixed on this impossible human with something that might have been curiosity. The 5th and final round was the test of blood, and it was exactly what it sounded like. Elena faced another blade dancer, this one the champion of the Queen's personal guard, and there would be no tricks or surprises that would work. Against a warrior of his skill, the fight lasted longer than anyone expected, mostly because Elena refused to die. Every time the champion cut her, she got back up. Every time he knocked her down, she found her feet again, and her blood painted the arena floor in patterns that the Valkyrie would remember for generations. She could barely see by the end, her eyes swollen and filled with blood, and her hands shook so badly that she could barely hold her weapon. The High Arbiter stepped forward and raised his hand, offering her the chance to withdraw with honor, to end the trial and accept a lesser punishment for Eth Rainey. Elena laughed, a broken sound that echoed through the silent arena. I did not walk across a desert for her just to quit now, she said. And she raised her weapon one more time. The champion came at her with killing intent, certain that this final blow would end the farce once and for all. But Elena had spent months learning Valkyrie combat techniques from Eth Rainey's descriptions, and she knew things that no offworlder was supposed to know. She dropped to her knees, letting the champion's blade pass over her head, and she drove her own weapon upward into the nerve cluster beneath his thorax. It was a dishonorable move, a strike that no true Valkyrie warrior would ever use against a worthy opponent. And the crowd gasped in outrage, but Elena was not Valkyrie, and no one had ever said she had to fight with honor. The champion fell alive but paralyzed, and Elena stood over him swaying on feet that could barely hold her weight. The trial is complete, the High Arbiter announced, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. The accused is proven innocent by combat. Elena heard Eth Rainey screaming her name, heard the cage doors opening, felt arms catching her as she finally collapsed, and then there was only darkness, and the distant sound of her friend weeping with relief and joy, and something that felt very much like love. The alien queen stared in shock and said, "Why does my daughter trust you so deeply, human?" Elena Vasquez spent 11 days in the medical alcove, her body more scar tissue than healthy skin, and the Valkyrie healers who tended her could not understand how she was still alive. Humans were supposed to be fragile, weak, easily broken. And yet this one had survived challenges that would have killed most Valkyrie warriors. They treated her wounds with the best medicines they had, technologies that had never been wasted on a human before. And slowly she began to heal. Eth Rainey never left her side. sleeping in a chair beside the bed, holding Elena's hand through the worst of the pain, and telling her stories about Valkyrie, history to keep her mind occupied during the long hours of recovery. When Elena finally opened her eyes and saw her friend sitting there, exhausted but happy, she smiled despite the pain. "Hello," Elena said, her voice rough from days of disuse. "Hello yourself," Ithrini replied, her translator turning her clicks into warm human words. "You have been asleep for a very long time. Did we win?" Elena Ithrini laughed, a strange clicking sound that Elena had learned to recognize as pure joy. "We won," the princess said. "I am free, and the real conspirators have been found and punished. And everything is going to be all right." Elena closed her eyes and let the relief wash over her. And for a moment she thought she might fall back asleep, but then she felt something change in the room, a presence that made even the air seem heavier. And when she opened her eyes again, she saw that they were no longer alone. Queen Kethara stood at the foot of her bed, ancient and vast and terrifying. 6 centuries of power and wisdom, compressed into a form that seemed too large for the room to contain. Elena had seen the queen from a distance during the trial, but up close the difference was overwhelming. This was not just a ruler. Elena realized this was a force of nature, a being who had watched empires rise and fall while she remained eternal and unchanging. Jithrin had risen from her chair and was bowing deeply, her whole body trembling with a mixture of fear and respect. But Elena could not bow, could barely move. And so she simply looked up at the queen and waited for a long moment. Kethara said nothing, her compound eyes studying Elena with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to examine the soul beneath. Then she spoke, her voice like the grinding of ancient stones. "My daughter has not left your side since you fell," the queen said. "She has refused all duties, ignored all obligations, and threatened violence against anyone who tried to remove her from this room." Elena glanced at Ithrini, who was staring at the floor with her markings dim with embarrassment. "I would do the same for her," Elena said simply. The queen's mandibles clicked in what might have been surprise. "Yes," she said slowly, "I believe you would, and that is what I do not understand." She moved closer to the bed, her massive form casting shadows across Elena's face. "I have ruled this hive for 600 years, the queen continued. "I have made alliances and broken them. I have watched species rise to power and fade into extinction. And I have learned that no one does anything without expecting something in return." Her compound eyes seemed to bore into Elena's soul. "You came here knowing you would probably die," the queen said. "You fought in a trial that no human has ever attempted. You shed your blood on our arena floor. And you asked for nothing, not wealth, not power, not favor, nothing." She paused. And when she spoke again, her voice was different, softer somehow, almost confused. "Why does my daughter trust you so deeply, human?" she asked. "What is it about your kind that inspires such loyalty, such devotion, when you have known each other for such a short time?" Elena looked at the queen, at this ancient being who had seen more than Elena could ever imagine. And she understood that this was not just a question about her, and Ithrinithis was a question about humanity itself, about what made humans different from all the other species in the galaxy, about why the universe should care about these soft, fragile creatures who had barely learned to travel between stars. Elena thought about her answer carefully, because she knew that what she said next might change the relationship between their species forever. "Because I showed up," Elena said finally. "When it mattered, when she needed someone, I showed up. And that is all trust has ever been, Your Majesty." She paused, gathering her strength. "There is no trick," Elena continued. "There is no secret human strategy. There is no calculation behind what I did. I simply saw someone who was hurt and scared and alone, and I could not walk away. Not in the desert, and not when she called for help." She looked at Ithrini, who was weeping quietly, her compound eyes producing tears in a way that Elena had learned was extremely rare for Valkyrie. "I love her," Elena said simply, "not because I expect anything from her, not because it benefits me, but because that is what love is. It is being there when the universe gives you every reason not to be." The queen was silent for a very long time. Elena watched her, trying to read something in those alien features. But the queen's face was as unreadable as stone. Then, slowly, the queen did something that made Ithraini gasp with shock. She lowered her head, inclining it toward Elena in a gesture of respect that no Valkyrie ruler had shown to any other species in over 4,000 years. "Perhaps," the queen said slowly, her voice heavy with something that might have been wonder, "we have misjudged your kind, human." She straightened and looked at her daughter, at the princes who had found something in this broken human that the entire Valkyrie civilization had failed to provide. "You may stay with her," the queen said to Ithraini, "for as long as you wish, and when she's healed, we will discuss what comes next." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Elena and Ithraini alone in the alcove. For a moment neither of them spoke. And then Ithraini climbed onto the bed beside Elena and wrapped all four of her arms around her friend. "Thank you," Ithraini whispered. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being you." Elena closed her eyes and held her friend close, ignoring the pain in her broken body. "Always," she said. "I will always come for you." 3 years later, when the swarm came from the darkness between galaxies, when every species in the Galactic Concordat received the same message promising extinction, it was the Valkyrie who spoke first at the Emergency Council. "We will follow the humans," Queen Cathara announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "We have seen what they do for those they love, and I tell you now, the galaxy should tremble at the thought of what they will do to those who threaten them." She paused, and when she continued, there was something like a smile in her voice. "Imagine what they will do for those they hate." The war that followed was terrible and long, but in the end humanity stood victorious with the Valkyrie beside them. Two species bound together by a friendship that had started in a desert and grown into something the galaxy had never seen before. And at the heart of it all, two figures stood together, one human and one Valkyrie, their hands intertwined as they watched the last enemy ships burn in the sky above. Then Elena looked at Ithraini and smiled. "We did it," she said. Ithraini's markings pulsed with joy. "We did it together," she replied. "And that is the human way, is it not?" Elena laughed and squeezed her friend's hand. "That is exactly the human way," she said. "We show up, we fight for each other, and we never, ever quit." Above them, the stars shone bright with the promise of a new future. And somewhere in the hive, Queen Cathara smiled as she remembered the day a broken human had taught her the meaning of trust. Some things truly did need no translation.